You're listening to the Tan Talk Radio Network.
Hey, we're back on Freedom Works, and we're delighted to have Chris Casey. He's the managing director of WindRock Wealth Management. He's also a contributing writer for the great Ludwig von Mises Institute, and he has penned an article about deflation. He calls it Deflating the Deflation Myth. And he talks about the fear of deflation, which, you know, both liberals and conservatives, libertarians, non-libertarians have talked about. I know Milton Friedman used to worry about deflation to a large extent. Chris, welcome to Freedom Works. Why do you say that there's a myth about deflation?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I do think it's an important topic that perhaps isn't addressed, well, certainly isn't addressed correctly in the media. And it is something that's in the news frequently, especially with whether it's Japan, which is actually experiencing or has experienced some deflation, whether it's the U.S., which has the current Fed chairman terrified of deflation, as well as her predecessors. And then, of course, you have the ECB, which is in the news right now, talking about how they have this single mandate, and it is to have a stable price level, so they're terrified of deflation.
The ECB, would you let our listeners know what that stands for?
Oh, sure, the European Central Bank.
Right, okay.
They're in the news frequently right now discussing deflation and how they're scared of it, and they're trying to increase the price level throughout Europe. So it's an important topic, and I think it's one that's misunderstood. Deflation not only is not something that, it's certainly not something that should be feared, and I think history proves that. In the 19th century, for America, we had extended periods of fantastic economic growth. And meanwhile, the price level dropped 50% at times over a long period of time. So it's not something that should be feared. The other point, which is not in the article that you referenced, what I think is equally important, is that deflation is actually an excellent mechanism to correct recessions and to speed the recovery process for an economy. And the reason that is because the more a currency is appreciating, so the more your dollar is becoming worth more and more relative to goods and services, the more likely you are to save more. And to the extent people save more, unlike conventional wisdom or certainly what the members of the Federal Reserve believe, the greater savings speeds a recovery process in recession and helps restore an economy, create a healthy economy, and set us up for the best prospects going forward to really grow.
Well, why did economists on both sides, like Milton Friedman and currently Paul Krugman and John Maynard Keynes, why to them was it such a big boogeyman?
It's a big boogeyman for both of those parties, but for completely different reasons. The Keynesians look at this and say, and there's some great quotes by Krugman, I think I used one in the article. They look at it and say, well, if you're going to have deflation, if you have prices that are falling, people are going to put off spending. And if they keep putting off spending, then, they're a consumption-based model. They believe if you don't have the consumption, you're not going to have the growth. So they're worried about deflation from the standpoint of it preventing consumption, right? The purchase of consumer goods by the populace.
But if the price comes down,
correct,
or deflates, wouldn't that be an incentive for people to buy it?
According to the law of demand, of course. But the idea is that they expect it to continue to go down. So, maybe tomorrow it's down X percent. Well, 6 months from now it may be down even more. If people assume that, they believe they'll hold off their purchase.
Oh, okay.
Even longer,
like a house or something.
Oh, anything. It could be electronics, could be the new computer. They believe any purchase that someone would do, they would hold off on, which obviously isn't correct because you can't forgo consumption forever. At some point, you need to have that good or service.
Well, it's like the stock market, isn't it? I mean, you see the stock market is going one way or the other, and you hold off making the decision because you think it will continue to go in that direction, but all of a sudden it stops, right?
It's somewhat analogous to that, yes.
Okay.
No, Friedman has a completely different reason in the monetarists for fearing deflation. They pinpoint deflation as the primary cause of the Great Recession and for business cycles in general. So Milton Friedman actually would call the Great Depression the Great Contraction, and he has a book that was published in 1963 called U.S. Monetary History of the United States with Anna Schwartz, in which he does these case studies and looks at periods in U.S. history and tries to, through inference of the data, blame the contraction of the money supply, which did contract, by the way, in the Great Depression, probably by a third. He blames that as the cause of the Great Depression. So both Keynesians and monetarists look at it for different reasons, but are equally scared of it.
Well, it's very interesting how that works. I mean, to the layman, if they see that the money that is in a deflation, they kind of think that's good. I don't know. They seem to think that they'll be able to spend more money, and the value of their money is more than it was before. I guess that's just a selfish individual look at it.
Well, that's how I look at it. I mean, I'd certainly, it'd be great if the money in my wallet was effectively appreciating as I was holding off on spending. That's a great, it's a great perspective.
Now, the Federal Reserve Chairman, is it Janet Yellen? Is that her name now?
Correct.
Okay. Where does she stand? It seems like she's going to hold on. Or let me ask you, what is her philosophy about the interest rates? I just want to tie it into inflation and deflation. Where does she stand now in terms of what she might do regarding the interest rate on money loaning?
Sure. Well, Janet Yellen, first of all, just her background. I mean, she's a Berkeley graduate. She's considered the most dovish member of the Federal Reserve in some time, meaning she's not worried about inflation. She's open to it, and I think that's a correct assessment. In fact, I think she will be perhaps one of the most damaging Federal Reserve.
So she would allow the interest rate to go up, do you think?
Well, no, she actually prefers interest rates to go down.
Well, right.
She would like to push them down as far as possible.
Okay, so she'd hold them down. All right.
Right. In fact, she has a famous quote from a few years back, and I can't remember the source, but she said, "Listen, if I could push interest rates to negative territory, I would."
Okay.
And so that's how dovish she is. She wishes to expand the money supply as fast as possible, as large as possible, in her mistaken belief that it will somehow help the U.S. economy.
So does that make her she also feels that deflation is a bad thing?
She does.
Okay.
She is equally scared of it. In fact, she's been quoted several times over the last couple of years as saying, "Hey, if you have deflation, it creates what she believes is some type of economic death spiral where people stop spending, and that causes other repercussions, and eventually the whole economy tanks." So she is terribly concerned about deflation.
We're talking, by the way, with Chris Casey. He has a very interesting article for the Ludwig von Mises Institute called Deflating the Deflation Myth. And Chris is the managing director at WindRock Wealth Management. So where are we going, do you think, Chris, with this whole situation? I mean, is the economy, because we've been holding down interest rates, has that been a bad thing? Is it slowing the recovery? How do you feel about the whole Federal Reserve approach right now?
Sure. Well, look, I guess what you can say, I could back up, because what the Federal Reserve is doing right now is merely a continuation of their actions since the 2008 Great Recession. So that Great Recession was met with kind of what I call a troika of trouble. You have massive bailouts, you have massive deficits, and you have just tremendous printing of money. All three of those measures are the exact opposite of what you want to do to get out of a recession. And so that's it's the worst possible medicine that they're administrating. So right now they're continuing that policy. I mean, while they're nominally supposedly reducing QE3, what I anticipate happening is that eventually, whether it's later this year or 2015, we're going to have a serious economic recession, or perhaps maybe they'll be preceded by some significant downturn in the equity markets, the stock market. If that happens, I think the Federal Reserve will go right back to their plan of attack that they've been using since 2008, and we'll see an increase in the money supply, maybe a QE4. I don't know if they're actually going to call it that. But somehow they're going to continue to increase the money supply, whether it's outright purchases, whether it's pushing down rates even further, possibly. They have a couple mechanisms they could still pursue, but I think they're going to just keep going with their current playbook. What
would you do if you were in their shoes?
Well, it's kind of funny that the Federal Reserve presents itself as this guardian of stable prices and stable interest rates or reasonable interest rates, I think is what they're charged with. And in fact, they're the only ones that can distort that. They're the only ones that can, in fact, do the opposite. So what I would do, I think the government shouldn't have anything to do with the money supply, much as it shouldn't have anything to do with many other areas of the economy. In fact, it's perhaps the most critical area of the economy that should not be tampered with. Or for that reason, it should not be tampered with. So, a lot of I adhere to the Austrian School of Economics, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. Ron Paul certainly was a supporter.
Right.
And it's not appropriate to say that we're advocates of the gold standard per se. What really we're advocates of is the free market determining what money should be. So I would be in favor of government getting out of the money business. Now, whether that's you have some kind of transitory phase where they just increased the money supply at X percent. I mean, that's what Milton Friedman wanted. He wanted a stable increase in the money supply so people could appropriately plan.
Mm-hmm.
Or you do it sooner. Either way, that would be a good thing. So first and foremost, it's just like a physician treating a patient. Do no wrong. And to the extent you're causing harm by increasing the money supply, by bailing out failed entities, stop doing that. That's the first thing that they should do.
And eliminate the Federal Reserve, much like what Ron Paul talked about?
Well, I think that makes absolute sense. I mean, it sounds shocking when we say it in today's day and age, but let's not forget that we didn't have a Federal Reserve for a large part of this country's history. And in fact, central banking didn't exist worldwide for a long time. The only reason to have a central bank is so that they could properly coordinate inflating the money supply among various banks. And there's no, people will say, well, society's more complex now, technology is more complex, etc. That's absolutely true, but those aren't arguments in favor of central banking. In fact, I think they have nothing to do with it. So eliminating a central bank, yes, I think that would certainly be beneficial.
I mean, we've all grown up with having the Federal Reserve, play around with the interest rate. But I've often wondered why it needed to be there. It seems like it's just like any other nanny state kind of program. It almost interferes with what people really want to do with their money.
Well, it's amazing that people think that the Federal Reserve is somehow endowed with this insight into what the appropriate level of the money supply should be. I mean, it's what F.A. Hayek, noted Austrian economist, when he accepted the Nobel Prize in economics, called the pretense of knowledge. They have no way of knowing this, and just like they would have no way of knowing how many bananas should be in the economy. So for the same reason, the Federal Reserve should not be involved, or any entity should be involved in dictating the amount of dollars in an economy.
I mean, Janet Yellen, to many people, is more powerful than Obama, the most powerful person on the planet.
Well, that's been said about a lot of Fed chairpersons, and I think we saw that most notably in 2008 recession. I mean, they were able to act unilaterally without oversight, and what some would argue is exceeding their mandates in their actions. So in a lot of ways, they are more powerful. And it goes back down to the Federal Reserve is the only entity that can really create inflation and can create recessions. These things don't exist as part of the free market. They're not part of capitalism. They are created and derived from intervention with the free market and capitalism.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Would depressions and the like occur without the Federal Reserve's involvement if we took it away? Would they? Or would those things be blips? You know what I mean?
Sure. I would argue they would not occur. And, if I think all you need to do is look at history to agree with that or to come to your own conclusion.
I mean, we had depressions before the Federal Reserve in 1913, right? We had depressions in the 19th century, or at least they were called such, right?
We certainly did. And what has been mistaken, though, is people think, well, the Federal Reserve has only been around since 1913. If you didn't have it before then, how could you account for recessions that happened? And the most notable thing that, here's a great travesty of history, is that the same time during the 19th century, when depressions and recessions first appeared, we had the Industrial Revolution going full-born. And because of that, a lot of economists and people associated the free market and capitalism with inherently having these recessions and depressions. What they overlook is at the same time period, we had either the advent of central banking and fiat currency. So fiat currency, just for some of your listeners, is currency that is mandated by the government. So by law, it's acceptable, and it has no alternative value. So it's something besides gold and silver. And so if you look at the history of business cycles, they didn't really appear before the 19th century. They were non-existent. They may be what would be called business fluctuations, where you have a war or the king takes a bunch of taxes and the economy goes down momentarily, but it wasn't recurring and it wasn't deep. And it wasn't until the 19th century in the U.S. where, yes, you did not have a Federal Reserve, but you had an inflation of the money supply, whether it's through banks that are issuing fiat currencies themselves, or most notably in the Civil War, the central government started issuing greenbacks, which were currencies unbacked by gold or silver. So that argument is unfortunately just an accident of history as far as timing.
So your argument would be that depressions and long recessions would not be in the cards had it not been for intervention, the arbitrary artificial intervention.
Absolutely correct.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, Chris, I want to thank you so very much for joining us. I found this to be really enjoyable talking and listening to you. Now, you're the managing director of WindRock Wealth Management. Here's your chance. You want to say anything about that?
Sure. Well, I'm a managing director there. I mean, there's a number of managing directors. We are a wealth management advisory firm, and so we manage money for wealthy individuals, anywhere from $1 million in net worth and up. And I think a couple things make us unique, and one that I'll point out is that we have a real perspective on the economy. So if you go to a lot of these firms, will tell you, well, you can't time the market, you just have to be in it, and who can predict when we're going to have a recession or inflation? But I think you can, and it just takes a grounding in economics. And so we do try to protect our clients from what we see as coming down the pike, which could be, well, we think significant inflation, certainly recessions down the road, and so we invest them accordingly. And so I think we're fairly unique in that aspect.
And again, your clientele, basically wealthy investors, did you say, $1 million or more?
Yes, wealthy individuals, anywhere from $1 million in net worth to we have clients that have several $100 million in net worth.
Okay, well, that will exclude me, but my colleague Lee Clark will be making a phone call.
Yeah, I'll need to get your number.
Well, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.
I did appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Chris. The very best to you. Really enjoyed it, and maybe down the road we'll talk again.
Great. Take care, guys.
All right. That was Chris Casey. We're going to take a short break, my friends. Johnny Cash going to let you talk to you for a moment, then we'll be back.